Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeremy. Welcome to Strange Radios, and it's time for an album review, Lustmord, First Reformed. Quickly, before we get into that, a quick thank you to the traction that my last video garnered. So, in 2019, I've just decided to start doing these album reviews, because I typically try to listen to new music every week, and just thought I'd do this for fun. And so my last album review, Malibu Ken, just did way better than any other video I had on my channel to this point. I think before this, my best performing video was like 40 views and maybe 2 likes. And that Malibu Ken review is now over 120 views, 7 likes, and I've gained a couple subscribers from it, which is kind of silly. But also pretty awesome. So yeah, thank you to everyone for that. And I figured I would follow that up with a review of a dark ambient project that serves as the soundtrack to a film that probably very few people have seen, and on top of which I am delaying it by about a week. That's got to keep the momentum going. But anyways, let's get into it. Lustmord, legendary industrial dark ambient composer from Wales, I think, from the United Kingdom. Anyways, often regarded as the progenitor of dark ambient music. And for anyone not familiar with what dark ambient perhaps means, think doom metal, but without the metal elements. Very elongated, dark-sounding music with swells involved, and you're pretty well on the right track. Lustmord's been doing this since, I think, the early 80s, and he really ushered in almost a whole new genre with what he was doing. Most particularly with his album Heresy in 1990, which was a real turning point for the genre. Anyways, this album here, First Reformed, is the soundtrack to a film from 2018 of the same name, which I have not seen and I do not know anything about. Now, that's kind of a risky move when reviewing a soundtrack, because obviously when it's tied into a film, watching the film is going to either enhance the soundtrack or at least bring more context to it. So I can understand why this review may not be entirely accurate, but it's my opinion that a soundtrack should be able to exist independently of the film. It should be able to tell its own story. And I have a feeling that Lustmord is of the same thought process when it comes to that, because most of his, if not all of his soundtrack works, at least all the ones that I've heard, do function independently. And while they do enhance the film and are enhanced by the film, they're not necessarily dependent upon their coexistence. So First Reformed has 8 tracks on it. It's just over 50 minutes. And like most dark ambient music, like most Lustmord albums in general, it has a very menacing sound, very brooding atmosphere to it. There's an intensity and a darkness that just covers and envelops the entire musical landscape on this record. And to me, what's particularly exciting about this record is the fact that it's almost always on the precipice of resolution. Like, it's got this sort of tenseness to it, and it's always sort of on the crest of being resolved, but it never quite gets there. And to me, that adds a level of anxiety to this dark, slow, brooding soundtrack that is just wonderful. It keeps you sort of on pins and needles for the most part. There are a few moments in this where perhaps a track or two tends to drag for being a little too long, or that the tenseness just sort of disappears for a few moments while the music sort of takes its foot off the pedal, if that can be applied as a phrase to dark ambient music at all. The first few tracks actually have a very interesting motif going on. The first track, Revelation, at the very beginning, you get sort of these very distant sounding, almost howls. Like I said, there's this tenseness that sort of exists throughout the whole album, and it's established early on the first track. But again, it's this distant howls that sort of are just sort of are in the back. You can hear them, but they're not the main focus. But then on the second track, there's more of a ghoulish sound, menacing sound to these howls, and they sound closer. There's this feeling of just being sort of boxed in, enveloped by this noise, this sort of looming darkness. Not darkness as in like a light shade thing, but darkness as in like an evil. And then on the third track, Discernment, it starts off with these swells that are punctuated by silence, and that carries on for a while before very subtly this sort of underlying static very subtly comes in, and then these metallic synths sort of build on top of that. And that closeness of those howls, those sort of menacing, ghoulish howls, gets even more intimate on this track. It almost sounds like a monster is breathing right near you. And so over these first three tracks, there's this real sense of claustrophobia sort of building up, which is sort of undone by the fourth track, Eden. It kind of ruins the momentum that this album is building. It's a bit of a lighter tone. I mean, not that you can have much of a light tone when it comes to sort of dark ambient music. It's still creepy. It sounds creepy, and there's a wind effect to it that is kind of cool. But the sort of noise story, as I'm going to call it, just sort of is brushed aside. It's kind of done, which is unfortunate. And again, this serving as a soundtrack, perhaps there's a reason for that. Perhaps Eden fits really well into the context of the movie, into the scenes that they're used in. But again, if a soundtrack is going to exist by itself, it's got to function by itself. And the placement of Eden in this soundtrack, I think, is a little unfortunate. The next track, Awakening, makes use of thunderstorms, which Lustmord, if you're familiar with Tool, you're familiar with his work with thunderstorms on 10,000 Days. And this track had me thinking of it reminded me of like a slower, more deliberate Hans Zimmer soundtrack with sort of those horns, but they're slower. They're slower. The next two tracks are actually very interesting, Accursed and Everlasting, because they both make uses of 1800s hymns. Accursed uses Onward Christian Soldiers in a very cool way at first. Basically, Lustmord sets up this very menacing, dark, almost harrowing soundscape underneath as a bed. And then on top of that, you hear Onward Christian Soldiers played on an organ. And it's really, it's kind of got this cool dichotomy going to it. And then the organ playing just stops very suddenly while the sort of undertones keep moving forth. And it gives you this real feeling of like whoever was playing the organ, whoever was playing Onward Christian Soldiers, was just very suddenly interrupted. And there's a moment of tenseness after that is palpable. But the only downside to this track is that it does that 4 times. After there's a sudden stop in the organ playing and the brooding synths carry on, the bass swells and whatnot, the organ comes back and then stops abruptly again, and then comes back and abruptly. And again, it works very well the first time, and I could even deal with it the second time. But after the third and fourth times, I don't know, it kind of got repetitive. Which is unfortunate because it was such a cool moment the very first time that it stopped. And Everlasting makes use of the hymn Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, which I think is played on a lute or some sort of stringed instrument. And this one, I think, while it doesn't have that sort of shocking moment that Accursed had when the organ stops, this one I think works better in the grand scheme. I think it comes together with the very stark, very dark tones that Lustmord has with the stringed lute playing of Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, I think the mixture there works a lot better and is very creepy. The last track, So Be It, nothing particularly special after everything else that you've heard on the album, but it does serve as an effective closer. I think it's the longest track on the album, and it just dwindles everything down. It just sort of cools everything down to a finish, to a finale. And I think it works. I think it works very well at that. It serves its purpose. Overall, as a dark ambient project, I think it's very cool. It's very engrossing, captivating. If you're not into it, or if you're not into dark ambient already, I would suggest giving this a shot. Just put it on, maybe in the background, and carry on with that. It's very cool. If you are familiar with dark ambient, then you probably already are well versed in Lustmord, and you should give this a listen anyways, even if you've already heard it. Yeah, it's a very good album. I'm gonna give it 7.5 out of 10. Very good, very fun listen. Like I said, a couple of sort of, I can't even call it weaker moments, but moments that just, where the album just sort of stands in front of itself, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I really dig it. I'm going to leave a link to the Lustmord's Bandcamp page down below. Leave a comment, tell me what you think of this record, if you've listened to it. And again, thank you for the interaction on the last video. That was really cool. Unexpected and cool. Anyways, this has been Strange Radios. Stranger, adios.